Hello. Hello. You're listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening, a podcast about David Lynch and Twin Peaks.
I'm Indigo.
And I'm Hilary.
And listeners, we're going to tell it to you. We're going to tell it to you straight. Today, we're talking about
T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, the rest of them.
I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
All right, listeners, just a reminder, this is part 2 of a 2-part project that we've been working on, diving into 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot. So if you haven't listened to part 1, you should do that first. If you're just finding us and this is the first thing that popped up, make sure you listen to part 1 first.
We aren't going to go into the kind of introduction we did last time. So yes, please make sure you go back to that so you can get all the information that will make this episode make sense.
Exactly.
So in that first episode, we spent the whole time talking about the first poem, Burnt Norton. And that sets a nice pattern that we can follow for this discussion of the remaining 3 poems, because those quartets do follow a pattern that Burnt Norton sets. Mm-hmm. As in the ascending spiral of Underhill's Mystic Way, though, there are significant variations within that pattern in each poem.
Yeah, first, each of the poems meditates on time, but a different kind of time. Burnt Norton is about personal memories. East Coker's meditation is on ancestral time, with a focus on family and racial origins. The Dry Swages is on ancient time, and Little Gidding is on essentially God's time, or the now. Eliot himself said that they are on the 4 elements too, so air, earth, water, and fire.
Across the poems, the 5 sections or movements, I like how some critics call them movements.
I like that.
They seem to correspond. So lots of scholars have made this argument, and we're just going to loosely summarize it.
The first sections in the poems focus on an experience of timelessness, a vision beyond linear time.
Right. So in Burnt Norton, that was the moment in the rose garden. But we'll see a similar moment in the other 4 quartets as well.
Yeah. And the second sections are about trying to cope with the loss of that transformative moment and a vain attempt to find it again in patterns.
The third sections are about purgation and purification. Mm-hmm. And then in the 4th section of each quartet, the speaker prays and meditates on death.
Mm-hmm. And then the 5th sections are codas that also meditate on the creative act, writing poetry in Eliot's case.
Right. So we're going to see that pattern in the remaining 3 poems.
Yes.
But after living with these poems for a few months now, reading and rereading as we've both been doing, I keep returning to the same questions. Personally, I think. And those are the questions that Eliot's posing throughout all 4 poems. After we have the transcendent vision, when we glimpse the still point of the turning world, what do we do next? Right? Like, how do we reconcile that moment with our ordinary experience, with our what's called lives in time? Mm-hmm. How do we find meaning again now that everything has changed? And then there's, like, as in the 5th movement of each, can we express in art what is ineffable? Can we use art to contain the infinite? And why do we want to so badly? I think Eliot searches for these answers for solace in philosophies throughout the poems.
Yeah, one place he explores is in the ideas of the philosopher Heraclitus. This makes sense. Very basically, Heraclitus perceived that everything in the world was constantly changing. Everything was in flux, but also that there was a rational structure or order to a pattern. That's logos. The tension between these seeming opposites, he believes, keeps reality together.
One thing that Heraclitus is really famous for is the metaphor of the river, and that's often expressed as one can't step in the same river twice. But the classicist Karl Reinhardt translates it this way. which is probably more accurate to Heraclitus's intent. His translation is, on those who step in the rivers, other and other waters flow. That expresses that the nature of the river is change/flux. If the water didn't move constantly, it wouldn't be a river.
True.
It'd be a lake.
Yeah.
But there is something fixed and stable about a river, and that is the fact of the river, the concept of the river. So the flux, the constant change, it doesn't destroy its constancy. It is a necessary condition of it.
Yeah, and some things stay the same only by changing constantly. Constancy and change aren't opposed, but inextricably connected. Eliot sees himself as lost in flux, in the motion of linear time, and is seeking the eternal. He's in the turning world, but he's searching for transcendence. He starts to look for it in patterns, like he's searching for that Heraclitean logos, order, pattern, rational structure in the sea of change. It's like he's trying to reconcile the turning world and the still point, linear time and timelessness, through this Heraclitean paradigm. Maybe both can exist in harmony with each other.
But I think the search for these patterns ultimately doesn't work for Eliot. In section 2 of the Dry Swages, which we're going to talk about today, he says essentially that we have these moments of transcendence, moments of happiness is what he calls them, but we miss the meaning. And then we try to approach the meaning, which, to quote Eliot, restores the experience in a different form, beyond any meaning we can assign to happiness. So that new approach through the pattern changes the meaning of the original experience. So do we see this in Twin Peaks The Return?
Yeah, so when we had first met to sort of talk about Heraclitus and this idea, which again, also listeners, one of the reasons why we especially want to mention this is because there is mention of Heraclitus in the epigraph. So this is how we know for sure that T.S. Eliot is having these ideas in mind. So when we had first talked about Heraclitus, the first thing that came to mind with the river was the idea of Coop trying to basically just like drop Laura back into the river. He's trying to sort of step into this river twice and assume that it's going to be in the same spot. You know, if we just go back, just drop her in, then that'll be great and fine. But yeah, it's the river is constantly moving, constantly changing. So no, that wasn't going to work.
Are we talking about when he goes back in time to get her again?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, like I think that him assuming that he can go back and change things, you know, it's the river has continued to flow, continued to change, because that is how it is. And with any time travel, it is a common theme. It's almost a necessary theme that something will go wrong, that it won't work the way that the person hopes it will, because that's just not how it is. There's always like the butterfly effect or something like that, or the universe will correct the change in a different way, because you can't just go back and change things and hope that everything's going to be all right, because time is this fluid thing that's constantly changing. So it's not as simple as just, it's not that linear timeline to go back per se.
Right. It's not a timeline, it's a river.
Yeah.
And so if we go back to the same place in the river and assume that we can just drop in, say to February 24th, 1989, we can't. It might be the same spot on the river, but there are different waters there. So the assumption that he can just go back to this particular spot, pick up where time leaves off there, or the timeline leaves off, it's ridiculous. It doesn't fit.
Right.
It will never work.
Well, and that plays into, again, one of the common themes with this is humility. And we talk about how Coop doesn't accept that. He doesn't accept his aging and his humility. He assumes that he is somehow above the river. He assumes that his ability is greater than the river, that he can surpass this, that he can beat it, and he can't.
So to go back to the four quartets, another place that Eliot explores for some kind of solace or resolution is Eastern philosophy, especially the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. And this also makes sense. Vedantic teaching lines up really well with Eliot's experiences, but this is really different from Heraclitus.
Yeah, the world in time, the turning world, is Maya, the illusory material world that we all inhabit. It's always changing, like Heraclitus's flux, but in this paradigm, the unchanging absolute, the ultimate reality, Brahman, is the still point of the turning world. For Heraclitus, the tension between flux and logos is the whole point. In Vedanta, the still point is reality, and the turning world is illusion. The still point is escape, it's liberation, it's the reality that dispels the fog of illusions.
Eliot meditates a lot on the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita throughout, especially in the dry swages. It's like he's looking for instructions on how to reach the still point, and honestly, they're all there. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita lays out the paths to spiritual progress. He hands Arjuna the instruction manual, and Eliot quotes or paraphrases some of those instructions in the poems. But Eliot's engagement with the philosophy is ultimately intellectual, not spiritual. And some Indian scholars have the perspective that Eliot gets really close to the answers, but ultimately falls short. So the Tamil scholar Purasu Balakrishnan, in the article An Indian View of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, puts this so beautifully. He describes all of Eliot's meditations as the preparation of the person for the goal. It's his preparation to equip himself to arrive and try to remain at the still point. Balakrishnan calls this the preparatory pluming and flapping of wings for flight. But the flight never happens. Eliot never takes off. Balakrishnan says, filled with thoughts, Eliot flaps his luminous wings in vain. This perspective suggests that Eliot is really close to that, quote, straight Vedantic flight to the still point, but he never flies.
Or maybe he can't. Eliot's speaker isn't a saint. Ultimately, this is an intellectual response to mystic intimations.
I personally find this very relatable. Yeah. I mean, I feel Eliot's frustration here. Yeah.
I mean, we were even just talking before we sat down about how hard it is sometimes to really connect with our creative selves in the way that the world kind of moves. It moves so fast these days. And it is really hard to slow down and focus on the spiritual to make the connections that we need to ultimately reach our higher selves and really connect with them.
Yeah. And it's interesting how Eliot explores different philosophies, religious traditions, spiritual traditions as a way to try to gain insight. Ultimately, he finds that resolution in his Anglican faith or something, if not resolution, then peace, acceptance of it. And I think that those of us who operate outside of a strict religious tradition are left at the questioning, kind of floundering phase in a way sometimes.
Yeah. No, I actually, this really brings to mind, I was just finally got around to watching Fleabag. Have you seen it?
No.
It's phenomenal, which I knew it would be. Everyone's always recommending it. But there's this moment, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's the main character is like a very complex young woman who is going through a lot of grief. Her best friend has died. She's still kind of grieving for her mother who passed away before, and she is just kind of a mess. She's in a really, really messy state in her life. And she falls in love with a priest. But they become very close. They fall in love with each other. But there's this moment that she's talking to him and saying how she wishes she could buy into it. She's like, I am not religious, but I wish I could be, because I just wish someone would just give me all the answers. It's this like heartbreaking scene that I really related to, where she's just like, I wish, she's like, you don't get it. I wish that I could be like you and I could trust this and believe in this, and just people could just tell me what to do and tell me what to think, and I would just know that it was right, and I could just know what to do with my life and how to move through the world. I want that. You don't understand how badly I want that, because it would be so much simpler.
You know, and Twin Peaks The Return feels to me very much like almost spiritual philosophizing without a structure. Mm-hmm. It within its own paradigm that it has created. Mm-hmm. So it's contemplating the same kinds of things that these larger religious traditions do, but without those guardrails or those definitions.
All right. So with that sort of baseline set and in the back of your mind, I think it's time to jump into the poems again. And we're going to start, of course, with East Coker. That is the next one after Burnt Norton, which is where we left off in the last episode.
So East Coker, just very generally, you know, it's a real place. It was where Andrew Eliot, an ancestor of T.S. Eliot's, left and came to America in 1669. It's also where Eliot's ashes are interred. Mm. And so the plaque that's in I think it's a church, where his ashes are, has the first and last lines of this poem on it. Oh. So in my beginning is my end, and then in my end is my beginning is on the plaque. Yeah.
Oh, I really love that. I didn't know that.
So this poem contemplates family and racial origins. It's like ancestral time and memory.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even when I was first reading it, listeners, when you go through this poem, you'll see it's very visual. I feel like as I was reading it, I was getting a lot of, like visuals, like daydreams in my mind, sort of this dancing, this movement. And I could really picture, it was very like, Outlander-ish almost. I don't know. I was kind of picturing that.
Yeah, it starts with just this whole picture of the village, like you said, and then he has this vision of his ancestors dancing. Mm-hmm. Speaking of visuals, though, I had to look up what he meant by a deep lane, which he repeats twice.
Oh, yeah.
And Indigo and I both got to see then photos of holloways that lead into East Coker, the village. This is not something we have here in America. And we were enchanted.
Yeah, I remember you showed it to me, and the first thing that came to mind, I think the first thing I said to you was, it's so like Studio Ghibli almost, like just beautiful, or very much like a labyrinth, like a hedge maze kind of labyrinth. There's something very magical and special to it. It's because it really sets you on your path. You can't really go anywhere except for where it's taking you.
Yeah, and I like that East Coker, the poem, is obviously rooted in this very specific place that Eliot feels this deep connection to because of his ancestors.
Right.
And so, he revisits this place, even if it's only via the poem, in an attempt to kind of find this transcendence again. Yeah. To find this meaning. And I like the idea when we're talking about Twin Peaks of seeking in a specific place some kind of meaning that we want to return to.
Yeah, you're chasing a feeling. You're chasing the memory and the nostalgia. I think we're all guilty of that. I mean, honestly, we hit that a bit in Burnt Norton too. Again, it's this, there is this sort of pattern to the poems of where we're sort of starting off in this way. Yeah, it's the same way that we go back to, a childhood home or a park we loved as a kid to chase that feeling again.
Mm-hmm. So critics look at this vision that Eliot has in a couple of different ways. The Western critics tend to see it as like he's looking at the time of the ancestors and the rhythms of an older and more ordered society, like rituals of this older agricultural world. But like the speaker he can't possess the experience. Like the meaning escapes him. The meaning of the rhythms has not been transmitted. You know, so this world of the past that he glimpses has no immediate value to him. But Eastern scholars see it as Maya.
Ooh,
So the ancestors are, this vision of the ancestors is of them trapped in this cycle of, quote, eating and drinking, dung and death. You know, so I like that contrast between the two different views of the poem.
Yeah. But where we both really begin to see connections with the return isn't until we really get into section 2. And even then, like, it's like, you know, a couple, quite a few lines into section 2 as well.
Yeah, well, Eliot starts again, right? It begins with this really weird, like archaic sort of tetrameter that he's using. But then he says, that was one way of putting it, not very satisfactory. And then he kind of restarts. He says, it was not, to start again, what one had expected. What was to be the value of the long looked forward to, long hoped for calm, the autumnal serenity and the wisdom of age? And Eliot here will begin to meditate on the lack of wisdom that comes from living and experience. So to summarize, Eliot basically says, like, we don't have anything to learn from old people. You know, first, he's like, they're either lying to us or to themselves or both. All they've given us is what he calls a receipt for deceit. Whatever serenity they have is just deliberate dullness. Their wisdom is just the knowledge of dead secrets, which he says are useless in the darkness they themselves have peered into or turned away from. So they either know it's useless or they're just deliberately ignorant. Like they've seen the darkness and they've willfully looked away from it. He claims that knowledge that we get from experience just imposes a pattern and misleads us. The present is always new. The actual pattern is always new. And the only thing we understand, he says, we are only undeceived of that which deceiving could no longer harm. I love that line. If we couldn't understand it, it couldn't hurt us anyway.
Right.
So, yeah, it feels like the knowledge gained from age is useless.
Right. I really love the last last several lines of the section 2, especially, do not let me hear of the wisdom of old men, but rather of their folly, their fear of fear and frenzy, their fear of possession, of belonging to another or to others or to God. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. The houses are all gone under the sea. The dancers are all gone under the hill. I remember reading this and just getting chills, and I immediately underlined those very last 2 lines as, again, this poem is very visual to me, and knowing in the back of my mind that I was trying to read it through the lens of the return, those 2 lines really put into my head this image of how the houses of like the original series, you know, like the Palmer house and stuff, it's like you know, I picture just like sort of the screen going black and like the dancers going under the hill, thinking of like Audrey's dance. You know, I just it was like this very visual image for me of like the you know, the Palmer house and all these other houses, like the Hayward house and stuff, and then the screen just goes to black, and characters like Audrey dancing, and it just goes to black, and I don't know, it was just like I had this big moment. I can even tell because my notes I had underlined with a different pen the first time I read, and then with a different color this sort of second time I went through, and that was in my first color. But yeah, this, especially again, coming back to humility, this is going to be this repeated theme. But the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless.
Yeah, to go back to Narsingh Srivastana's article about the ideas of the Bhagavad Gita in these poems, he said that humility, like love earlier in the poem, is a virtue that's a prerequisite to perception of the still point. Without humility, we can't get there. So because of this idea of like the world in time, the world of the ancestors as being close to Maya, like a depiction of the realm of Maya, redemption isn't possible without transcending this realm. And that can only be attained by desireless, by humility, and by love.
Right. And as we talked about with Burnt Norton, Coop kind of turns his back on love, on choosing just having a quiet life with a loving family. He turns his back on humility by assuming that he can just use the river however he likes, the river of time. And that's not the case. So we're again looking at these, Cooper in his aging, has he gained any wisdom?
I think because The Return is so much a meditation on aging, we see so many older characters in it. Have they gained wisdom with their years?
Right.
I don't know. What do you think?
I think it definitely depends on the character. I think that there are also some characters that we could easily, we see them in the original series as already being quite wise. So, like, I would say, like the wisdom of the Log Lady, of Deputy Hawk, like these are people who have already sort of, when we see them in the original series, like they're already sort of on their journey of focusing on, this wisdom and humility.
I was just going to say, they operate with a lot of humility.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great gentleness about them that when they are sharing information, it never feels like condescending or anything. It's like it feels very genuine.
I was just thinking of Hawk's famous, "Is it about the bunny?"
I know. Like, I mean, he's always willing to be open to what the universe is showing him. He's not going to judge per se.
Right. And so that is a very nice demonstration of the kind of humility that's a contrast to what Eliot's criticizing of, like, the supposed wisdom of old men. Right. He's not presuming.
No, never.
To have this. He continues to have this open mind.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I love so much about his character is that the way that he moves through, any of the episodes from the original series to The Return, it's with that gentleness, the humility, the willingness to listen and understand. I feel like he's very much a character that listens to other characters in a way that not everyone does.
And even with the Log Lady, with Margaret Lanterman, the wisdom that she has comes from the log, right? And her humility and kind of willingness to translate.
Right, without embarrassment.
Yeah, the messages that she's getting through that.
Right. She's never like, so, because she could easily have just been, she could have just kept it to herself. She could have just been like, this would be way too embarrassing to tell people, hey, my log said this.
Or she could pretend that it came from her.
Yeah.
That she is the seer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But then we have the contrast with Cooper, as we've said, that he doesn't operate with the aura of humility at all. It's the opposite. Even the way The Return begins with the giant speaking to him and in him responding, I understand. Well, clearly you don't. And the giant says, you are far away.
Right. Well, and I think that the thing that kind of jumps into my mind, something that we mentioned in the last episode, was my love and experience with tarot. And we've talked about how I would do a Twin Peaks tarot deck. I would make Cooper the Fool because he has that excitement, the adventurous, the, naive nature. that goes along with the Fool. And I think that that's a perfect representation of that, is that he's just eager to jump in and, and again, lacking that humility. There's like, again, if we're talking about the energy that these characters exude that do have humility, it's that calmness. And I think that while there are totally times where Cooper expresses a calm energy, a lot of people say he's like their comfort character, and he is for me as well.
Right.
At the same time, there's this like boyish eagerness to him as well that kind of defies that calm humility that plays into more his ego.
And once he becomes Richard, for lack of a better term, that charm is lost.
Yeah.
And he's just this odd kind of cold character who now is operating without humility, but also without likability.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That scene in Judy's diner when he throws the guns into a deep fryer.
I know.
Like, that makes no sense.
Right.
And he's very unlikable.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we should note is such a credit to Kyle MacLachlan as an actor.
For sure.
I mean, nailing multiple characters in one season.
Yeah.
So with this, before we get lost in too many rabbit holes, let's move on to section 3.
So in section 3, Eliot's speaker starts to contemplate how do we attain humility, this humility that we need in order to dispel Maya and to transcend. And so first, maybe it's to accept death as inevitable. And so the beginning of section 3 seems to start with that. And I know there are lines here that you really like.
Yeah, especially the line, "And we all go with them into the silent funeral, nobody's funeral, for there is no one to bury." I remember that was, as I was saying before, I used different colors to underline, and that was something that jumped out to me in the first reading because, again, in this sort of visual way of reading through it, the image that came to mind was very much of Laura, because it's this idea that, obviously we have her funeral, we have her burial, but we're not really burying Laura, we're burying her body. She's alive in many ways. She's alive in Maddie. She's alive in the Red Room. Her spirit is still alive in many ways. And then in the Return, we see it's alive in even more ways.
Right after that, Eliot says, "I said to my soul, be still and let the dark come upon you, which shall be the darkness of God." PS3, the scholar, points out that the darkness of God is what can vanquish Maya. So when Eliot goes on to use this metaphor of being in a theater when the lights are extinguished for the scene to be changed, there's a hollow rumble in the wings with the movement of darkness on darkness. So if you've been in a theater, when they're changing the sets and we kind of hear all of this, it's like this willingness to experience the uncertainty, the liminality of this transition. That is also a way to attain humility. Give yourself over to the uncertainty of this transition in the darkness.
I love this imagery as well. I love that line in general. I just think it's such a beautiful line, like the "with the hollow rumble of wings" line. But I feel like it also plays into this idea of if we picture our lives broken into acts, almost like a play. I think that's such an interesting way to approach it as well. Very beautiful imagery. And I feel like, I think any Twin Peaks fans, if you asked them to make a list of just things that they associate with Twin Peaks visually, those curtains are going to be some of them.
Like theater curtains.
Yeah.
So the scholar PS3, again, looks at that line, and the bold, imposing facade are being rolled away as that's Maya, that the darkness of God is rolling away so then we can perceive reality. Right. It dispels the illusion.
And then further along in this section, there's another line that I really love. "Wait without thought, for you are not ready for thought. So the darkness shall be the light, and the stillness the dancing." I Particularly, one of the things that I had put as a note for these lines as well was it kind of reminded me like it could be a line out of Harriet's poem almost. Just mentioning like the light and the dancing. I think in general, the four quartets, there's a lot of lines that really harken to Harriet's poem for me. And these were like, this was a particular line that stood out. And, you know, obviously these are playing off of some of the themes that we've been mentioning over the last episode and so far in this one. But I just think that they're very beautiful and I feel like very straightforward.
In the next stanza of section 2, Eliot says, "You say I am repeating something I have said before. I shall say it again. Shall I say it again? In order to arrive there, to arrive where you are, to get from where you are not, you must go by a way wherein there is no ecstasy. In order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way which is the way of ignorance." And he goes on a little bit more from there in a similar vein. He's emphasizing that in order to be transformed, we have to wait. We have to wait with humility and endure. That we cannot rush in. We have to be passive instead of active. This description, though, of the place where there is no ecstasy, the way of ignorance, it's a place of dispossession. I think of the state that Audrey's in, again, like we talked about in Burnt Norton, in part 12 onward in The Return, feels very much like this uncomfortable liminal space. I think the Odessa world we see, where Cooper finds Carrie Page, feels like this very much too.
Yeah, there's like also like a slowness to it that's hard to describe, except slowness was the first word that came to mind.
Right. That these are places where our characters are being forced to wait.
Yeah. Very liminal.
To endure. Yeah. So for efficiency's sake, we're going to move a bit more quickly. The only thing I want to point out in the remainder of East Coker for our purposes is in the last section. Eliot alludes to something from the Bhagavad Gita. He says, "For us there is only the trying, the rest is not our business." This is a paraphrase of the 47th stanza in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna says to Arjuna, "Your right is to work only, but never to the fruit thereof." Krishna's talking about dharma in that case, that the work is working in your dharma, doing your dharma, and you must be unattached from outcomes. You just concentrate on doing what is needed, what needs to be done, and the outcomes are not your business. It's clearly a work of humility, but in the Bhagavad Gita, that's the key to spiritual progress. That's the key to freedom and liberation. Because Wally Brando, of course, brings up my dharma is the road, and because in the last episode we talked about Audrey's dance, you know, that all of our characters perhaps work in their dharma in a way, an attempt to seek liberation. Audrey's dharma is the dance. Wally's is the road. You're entitled to the trying only, to the work. The rest is not your business, says the Bhagavad Gita.
The last thing I really want to touch on before we move on to the dry swages is really just the last line, the very, very single last line, "In my end is my beginning." I remember underlining this immediately when I was first reading it because it made me think so much of Laura, because the show starts with her end, but it's only the very beginning. Like, we literally start with her death, and then that is the beginning of the show. The whole rest of the show is where we dive into who Laura really was. So that's only the beginning for her, honestly.
And the first line of East Coker is, "In my beginning is my end." You know, and T.S. Eliot's meanings aside, when we think of the way The Return begins with what could easily be the end. of the return, with the giant referring to things we don't understand until part 18.
Right. Yeah, I just love it so much.
I love it too.
And I think it is so very Twin Peaks coded.
Yeah. Also the motto of Mary Queen of Scots.
Oh, yeah. I did not know that. Oh, I love
Yeah.
when we do a little bit of history.
Yeah.
All right. And with that, we're going to move on to the dry swages. So again, if you're following along with us, now would be the time to flip to that.
So the dry swages concentrates on ancient time, and it uses the unutterable antiquity of the sea to contemplate this ancient time. I love how this begins by imagining the river as a god. We've both lived in Japan.
Yeah.
So the idea of the kawa no kami is what I thought of immediately here.
No, definitely. Yeah, this idea that these natural things have their spirits.
But the river, although he imagines it a god, is easily tamed by man and then kind of forgotten. And then he contrasts that with the sea.
Right.
The sea, we have a very different relationship as human beings with that. It's like we basically just skim the surface of it. As fishermen, we can't manage it, we can't understand it. Now apparently there are aliens living in it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think when we talk about the sea, when we talk about like rivers, it's very much like, oh yeah, like whatever, it's a river and stuff. But then, yeah, when we talk about the sea, I think one of the first things people say when they talk about like the ocean and stuff is that it is so unknowable. There's so much that we have no idea what's going on, especially the deeper we get. We can't even get all the way to the bottom in many areas. And there is flora and fauna that we are completely unfamiliar with down there.
Right.
And it's quite terrifying when you see pictures and videos.
It
They
really
usually look
is.
really scary.
It really is. And Eliot talks about this too, that, we can't think about it.
Yeah.
It's too much for us. And so we just kind of focus on what we can do on the surface, like kind of he talks about fishermen basically using it for whatever profit they can get.
Right.
But that our relationship to the sea is like our relationship to time. We believe that time is a river, to go back to what we talked about earlier, but Eliot's saying time is actually the ocean. The river is something manageable
Right.
for humans, something easy to understand. There's a beginning and an end,
Right.
where the ocean is chaos and mystery, and very, very difficult for us to contemplate.
Yeah. Actually, something that popped into my mind just now was, listeners, if you haven't listened to the episode we did with Counter Esperanto, you definitely should. We had kind of talked in that episode about how, overwhelming and frightening the sea can be, how unknown it is.
Absolutely.
Beaches are such a spooky liminal place sometimes.
When we think about Cooper trying to go back in time as if it's a river, he literally gets swept into an ocean.
Yeah.
As is Laura.
Oh, yeah.
When he's trying to lead Laura through the woods to take her home and she gets pulled away.
Yeah.
When he, befuddled at the end, says, like, what year is this? He's missed the whole point. He is now outside of linear time.
Right.
And in the ocean that Eliot's kind of conceiving here in the dry swages.
Plus, I think that there's this general idea that with a river, you can probably touch the bottom, or at least you can get to the bottom somehow. And then again, we talk about a lot with the ocean that there are many areas where we may never see the bottom of it.
There were particular lines here regarding the ocean, though, that you really liked, right?
Yeah, so particularly some lines that jumped out to me immediately with just the visual sense of them. The salt is on the briar rose, the fog is in the fir trees. The thing that really jumped out to me with the briar rose bit was if I pictured Briar Rose as Sleeping Beauty, which is another of her names, thinking of Laura as Sleeping Beauty and like sea salt on her when she's pulled out of the wall, like when we see her wrapped in plastic, she's got like this like like kind of like
Gravel.
yeah, like there's like, this like dirt and stuff on her, and she's so pale, and like you could think of it as like sea salt, kind of like in the sea mist, sort of. And then the fog is in the fir trees just feels like a description of the opening scenes that we see when we pan across the forest. And so these two lines were so visual for me as just the straight up, like, kind of first scenes we get of Twin Peaks.
I love that. I have to admit, I see an uncanny resonance here also at the end of this first section of The Dry Swages.
Oh my gosh.
So I know that Eliot's talking about the anxious, worried women who are likely the wives of sailors.
You're right.
But I think we both had the same reaction to this.
Yeah, I have a little tab in my book that just in all caps says Sarah Palmer.
I have Sarah Palmer written in all caps here too.
With an exclamation point.
It says, he's talking about time, this ancient time being older than the time of chronometers, older than the time counted by anxious, worried women, lying awake, calculating the future, trying to unweave, unwind, unravel, and piece together the past and the future, between midnight and dawn, when the past is all deception, the future futureless, before the morning watch, when time stops and time is never ending, and the groundswell that is and was from the beginning clangs the bell.
I can just picture Sarah with her hands up in her hair and just screaming. It completely reads as Sarah to me.
So much of this language does, right? The future, futureless, trying to piece together the past and the future. It's unweaving, unwinding, unraveling. The state of mind, the grief that she's in.
She's so completely unraveled. And yeah, the anxious, worried women lying awake, calculating the future. Oh, Sarah.
Poor Sarah.
Poor Sarah.
Clings the bell, though. And clangs the bell appears, on two separate lines. The word clangs and then the bell.
Yeah.
And then we have that memorable scene of Sarah watching the boxing match that's looping. And every time the bell clangs.
Yeah.
That's one of the scenes that leads into an Audrey and Charlie scene, too.
Yeah.
Where this book, of course, appeared. So, I don't know. I think it's an uncanny resonance, but it would be really fun if it was intentional.
Right. Yeah. We have no reason to believe that it is, or we have no proof that it is. But it would be pretty cool if it was.
So, for the sake of time, we're just going to very quickly move through section 2. It's where Eliot meditates on how large and incomprehensible the sea is. And then he begins to make references to ideas that appear in the Bhagavad Gita. And it's important because he begins section 3 by saying, I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant, among other things. And so in section 3, he has direct references to both Krishna and Heraclitus.
Yeah.
And this reference to Krishna culminates really with how this section 3 ends, where he says, not farewell, but fare forward, voyagers. According to Narsingh Srivastana, this prophetic admonition of Eliot's here, fare forward, alludes to no other source than the Bhagavad Gita. The meaning and purpose in life consist in faring forward.
Right.
Just do the work in your dharma. It's not farewell. We don't know what well means.
Right.
Just fare forward.
Yeah. Well, and some lines that I really love that tie in with that so well are a little bit earlier in section 3. And the way up is the way down. The way forward is the way back. You cannot face it steadily, but this thing is sure, that time is no healer, the patient is no longer here. I love this idea of, again, sort of calling back to the spiral that up is down, forward is back. You're going in not a linear line. And this time is no healer. The patient is no longer here. Those lines felt like a gut punch when I was reading them, because we're placing this responsibility on time that, again, there's this, like, of course, the classic phrase, like, time heals all wounds, but sometimes it doesn't. And the patient is no longer here. I love this sort of idea of playing into the river of, the flow is constantly going, things are constantly changing. So how can we necessarily assume that time is going to heal something in the past when the water is long gone at this point? We're way further down the river at this point.
The idea that time is no healer, I think, is so vividly apparent throughout The Return.
Oh, yeah. But with the state that we see some of the characters in, time has not done them any favors. They're still dealing with these old wounds for sure. I mean, even the first one that comes to mind is Bobby's reaction at seeing Laura's photo. He's still not over it. How is he supposed to be?
And the one that I think of right away is Diane.
Yeah.
And now I know that the Diane we see for most of The Return is a tulpa or whatever, but her pain at her memory of being assaulted by Cooper is so fresh and so vivid. And her compulsive drinking and all of the things she's doing. If it's been 25 years or 20 some years since this happened, time has not healed her.
Time has not healed Audrey. When we see her, she's in a very fractured state.
It's definitely not healed Sarah.
No, not at all.
Right. So I know we've discussed this in other episodes, but one of the things I really treasure, I think, about David Lynch is how much he, as a storyteller, honors the pain that victims experience.
Oh, yeah.
And the fact that they are permitted in this work of art to feel this kind of pain this long, I think does honor to the real suffering of victims.
Right, because I think that's something that there's obviously a lot of discourse about, is the way that he certainly has some of these characters in very traumatizing situations. And people are like, oh, why would he show this? Why would he put this kind of darkness in there? But here's the thing. He acknowledges it. He acknowledges the pain that this causes. He acknowledges the effect that it will have on these characters for years to come. It's not like he's throwing it in there just for shock value. That's the thing that people don't always understand, is when he's having these situations happen and these experiences happen, it is not for shock value at all. It is because this is an integral part of this character's journey. This is something that will affect them for years to come, and that's just part of who they are, unfortunately, because oftentimes it is these horrible things that have happened to them.
Some other lines from section 3 that really resonate in The Return are when he says, "Fare forward, travelers, not escaping from the past into different lives, or into any future. You are not the same people who left that station, or who will arrive at any terminus while the narrowing rails slide together behind you. You shall not think," I just skipped ahead a little, "you shall not think the past is finished or the future is before us." You know, when Cooper and Diane are in the car and, once we cross, it could all be different. We will not be the same people we were who started this journey. Literally.
Yeah. Right.
They aren't. They have different names. They are different people.
Right. If there was a line that I could just read to Cooper, it would probably be these.
Yes. But it connects back to what Eliot describes in East Coker of like the necessity of that humility in the transition. And just knowing we will be changed by the experience. So shall we fare forward?
Yeah.
Let's fare forward. Not necessarily well.
No, I like that. I like that.
So we're skipping section 4, which is a prayer and a meditation on death. But in 5, Eliot talks about how human beings use all these different methods to divine the future or to understand the past. And he goes through all kinds of things. People have used horoscopes and reading the palm and so forth. But he says, of all of these strategies that we use, that men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that dimension. But to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. So he's contrasting, I guess, what this poem is meditating on, this intersection between time and timelessness, with all the other ways that people have tried to harness the spiritual world in a way to understand time, but it's a linear time.
Yeah.
He says, like, that's a human way of kind of harnessing spirituality to make meaning out of time. What he's talking about in this poem is the occupation for a saint.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know there were particular lines in that beginning section that you really liked.
Yeah, they're particularly, it's really just a couple of words, really just a little section that when I read it, the first thing that popped into my mind was, wow, that's just kind of how you could describe David Lynch's work, is to explore the womb or tomb or dreams. And I feel like, the womb, Eraserhead. The tomb, a lot of them, there's a lot of death times. And then dreams, obviously, is so Lynchian. Obviously, I'm really just
I
squeezing
enjoy
that in.
But no, I love it. And it's preceded with, or dissect the recurrent image into preconscious terrors. That's very Lynchian,
It is. And then some of the last sort of several lines that really jumped out to me were, here the impossible union of spheres of existence is actual. Here the past and future are conquered and reconciled, where action were otherwise movement of that which is only moved and has in it no source of movement, driven by demonic, chthonic powers. And right action is freedom from past and future also. I really loved these because specifically the mention of demonic and chthonic powers really jumped out at me, because it's really addressing the darkness in a way that I don't think the poems have yet so far, to specifically call the demonic and chthonic. It's really interesting to me because, of course, with The Return, there is so much discussion, about the darkness and the dark characters that we see, and what exactly are these entities, and how can we classify them? How can we address them? So this specific mention of that is something that really jumped out at me.
I'm glad you read that out loud, because when he says, and right action is freedom from past and future also, right action, again, would be dharma, right? And working without attachment to outcomes. That's going to be freedom from linear time also. He says, for most of us, this is the aim, never here to be realized, who are only undefeated because we have gone on trying.
Right.
It's an acknowledgement that it's not likely we're going to get there. We're not going to reach understanding or that kind of spiritual union, but we keep trying. We keep working for it.
Well, that's something that so very much interests me in the concept of past lives, is this idea of, because something that's so very much tied in with that is this idea that you have these multiple lives because you haven't achieved something, and you're like still trying to find the answer, or achieve this state that you are transcending out of these lives, sort of. Obviously different cultures have different takes on this, but I it's something that really fascinates me. This idea of I've had a couple like past life readings done by professionals, and I think it's so fascinating because I think that there's this idea that you can learn from them, of like, okay, so this is what went wrong in the past, and maybe in this lifetime I have the opportunity to address that and sort of beat that, which I couldn't in my past. All right, and then we're here at last, listeners. We are moving into the final poem in the 4 quartets, which is Little Gidding.
Little Gidding, also an actual place. It was the site of an old Anglican settlement, so it makes sense that Eliot would use this, being someone who is a devout Anglican, as the site of the present, where he is, essentially in God's time. And in the first section, second stanza, he imagines us arriving there, and he repeats multiple times, if you came this way, and describes like the route that we might take, or the condition, the state of mind we may be in when we come here, presumably to the actual place of Little Gidding. The repetition of if you came this way is almost an incantation.
Oh, yeah.
When he says, though, that we will arrive here, it's not to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity, or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. It's a sacred place. It's not the only sacred place. Eliot says there are other places which also are the world's end, and says some of them are the sea jaws or over a dark lake and so forth. He's basically beginning this poem by asserting that there are places on earth that are just sacred.
Yeah.
That we come to, or maybe the veil is thin here, whatever it is, it's a place that's ideally suited for us to kneel. I love that gesture of humility. We're not here to learn. We're not here to be curious.
Yeah.
It's a gesture maybe of worship, of humility, and that's what will give us, hopefully, access to the still point. And by the end, it's as if we are in the still point with Eliot's speaker. Finally, after all these poems, we're there with him.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, speaking to that humility, there's, in this section 1, there's some lines that I really loved. And what you thought you came for is only a shell, a husk of meaning, from which the purpose breaks only when it is fulfilled, if at all. Either you had no purpose, or the purpose is beyond the end you figured and is altered in fulfillment. Like, what humbling lines.
Yeah, and he says that, like, we arrive there like a broken king. We've been broken down and humbled to arrive at this spot. And did this speak to you of something in The Return in particular?
Yeah. Oh, the note that I have with it on my little tab is for sure Coop's attempt to save Laura. Because it is like these gut punch humbling lines are the feeling I feel in those last few moments.
Yeah, or the purpose is beyond the end you figured and is altered in the fulfillment.
Yeah.
I don't think it's until he says, what year is this?
Yeah.
That he realizes he doesn't know what's happening.
He doesn't understand where he's gotten himself or what he's done. He like, it's a gut punch. Some of the last lines in this section also really just give me chills. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Fire walk with me. Come on. I mean, there throughout four quartets, there are a lot of mentions of fire. That is sort of just one of the themes that comes up a lot. But this idea of the communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living.
What comes right before that is, and what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you being dead. Outside of Eliot's intention, Lara speaks much more coherently of her experience once dead than she was ever able to while present. Well, after this lovely moment with Eliot's speaker in the still point, we plunge into darkness again because, of course we do. We're always on that spiral in this poem and in that mystic journey. What's unexpected, though, in section 2 is that after the plunge into darkness, we've come to expect that Eliot will analyze, that plunge into darkness, but instead we switch to a vision, a narrative. Eliot says, in the uncertain hour before the morning, near the ending of interminable night, at the recurrent end of the unending, as if we're now out of time. This is where he begins a description, walking on a street outside of time and meeting some dead master. He describes of this dead master, whom I had known, forgotten, half recalled, both one and many, in the brown-baked features, the eyes of a familiar compound ghost, both intimate and unidentifiable. Here's where I start to, frankly, go off the rails.
Yeah.
And I see this as the meeting between Lara and Cooper. That Cooper would be in the narrative position here, the I, and the dead master, Lara. This familiar compound ghost, both intimate and unidentifiable, they never met in real life.
Right.
And
They never met living.
And she is here now, Carrie Page, also.
Yeah.
She is a compound ghost. Multiple beings in one.
Right.
It goes on, so I assumed a double part. So now he is a split person as well. And cried and heard another's voice cry, assuming duality. So he is both Cooper and perhaps Richard.
Yeah.
What, are you here? Although we were not. I was still the same, knowing myself, yet being some other. I think as fans, that encounter in Odessa and then the car ride back to Twin Peaks, it is so important, and yet so little is said during that time. I enjoy allowing this part of the final poem in four quartets to almost give voice, a potential voice, to that scene.
Yeah.
Eliot's speaker goes on to say that they are too strange to each other for misunderstanding in concord at this intersection time of meeting nowhere, no before and after. They are strangers meeting in this liminal space and time, very much the way Cooper and Carrie Page, Richard and Carrie Page, finally meet in Odessa.
Right.
They are nowhere.
Yeah.
No before and after. But Eliot's speaker asks the dead master to speak. And the dead master says, and so this is the character who I put in Lara's place, I am not eager to rehearse my thoughts and theories which you have forgotten. And goes on to say, but as the passage now presents no hindrance to the spirit unappeased and peregrine between two worlds, become much like each other. So I find words I never thought to speak, in streets I never thought I should revisit, when I left my body on a distant shore.
I did have those last two lines of that underlined, that in the streets I never thought I should revisit when I left my body on a distant shore. Oh, I feel like a lot of this is just going to be me sighing.
I mean, at the end of this journey, they are walking down streets that Laura did not think she would revisit when she left her body on the shore.
Right.
Well, the dead master / Laura goes on to tell Eliot Speaker some important things. Says, "Let me disclose the gifts reserved for age, to set a crown upon your lifetime's effort," and then describes some lessons, basically. The last of these is particularly relevant. The dead master says, "And last, the rending pain of reenactment of all that you have done and been, the shame of motives late revealed, and the awareness of things ill done and done to others harm, which once you took for exercise of virtue."
The shame. Ugh.
Do you think this is an apt description of Cooper? Things ill done and done to others harm, which once you took for exercise of virtue.
I think that there are certainly circumstances where that works, and also especially because of the way that he's split into different characters, because certainly some parts of him have done a lot of harm. But even just how we talked about how him leaving the possibility of this loving family, that he thinks he's doing the right thing by going to by leaving them to focus on Laura. He thinks that that's virtuous, but really he's leaving them, and that's also hurtful. That's also harm done.
The shame of motives late revealed. What are his motives? To be the hero. Is it to be the white knight? Instead of submitting with humility to the path the universe sets, you decide your course. It's the opposite of what Krishna tells Arjuna to do. Cooper is entirely attached to outcomes.
Yeah, he's not faring forward. He is so focused on returning to the past and trying to just jump in and change things. And as we've said before, that's just not an option.
He's trying to fare well, not forward.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The dead master finishes and leaves, and the day was breaking in the disfigured street. He left me with a kind of valediction and faded on the blowing of the horn. And so Eliot Speaker has learned from this dead master. In The Return, importantly, we don't see Cooper attempting to learn anything from Carrie Page. And so what strikes me about these two scenes side by side is that Eliot's modeling learning from the dead master and taking these lessons in his attempt to find transcendence. Cooper doesn't think he has anything to learn from Carrie Page. He wastes potentially a whole car ride, all that time with her, just in silence, because he thinks she has nothing to teach him.
Yeah. I think the thing that's really interesting with this idea of Cooper not talking to Laura, when this would really be a great opportunity for him, because when we think about like his encounters with her in the red room that he's had, where she's so fractured, and like talking backwards and stuff, like it's, that's such a difficult way to communicate with someone. And he's got this opportunity right in his hands, and he's not making use of it as much as he could be, which is kind of frustrating almost, or just like disappointing.
He presumes he has not a thing to learn.
Right. That he already knows all the details, that he knows everything already. And it's like, no, there's still so much to unpack here. And then that's also denying us, the viewers, the pleasure of knowing these intimate things. And then moving on to section 3, we don't have like a lot here that we wanted to particularly touch on, but some of the last lines really spoke to me. Whatever we inherit from the fortunate, we have taken from the defeated. What they had to leave us, a symbol perfected in death. This line kind of reminded me of something we've talked about in past episodes, as the dead girls that are frozen in time as perfect. This symbol perfected in death. Like Nancy Clutter, the way that Laura is held in this frozen in time image as, the pretty girl in the photo. The way that, because we've kind of touched on how, obviously we're seeing Laura through this lens of the people that were close to her and the people that are looking into the reality of her life. But to most people in the town, like we don't really get to see the day by day, just normal citizens that probably just think of Laura in this very particular lens. They don't know about all of the dark things that were going on necessarily.
Section 4 of Little Gidding kind of makes an ultimate theological statement. All of these have been meditations on death and prayer. And since this is the last one, it makes a strong statement. In 5 is a really interesting coda because it recalls language from moments of all 4 poems. Mm-hmm. He ends this poem with a sense of the final ring of the spiral. And it seems to end with a little bit of dissatisfaction. Mm-hmm. It's like Eliot's speaker knows what union with the divine will look like and feel like, mm-hmm. but it isn't clear that he is experiencing it. Mm-hmm. It's almost a comfort with the lack of it. He says, "We shall not cease from exploring, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." He's content now with the journeying.
Right. I mean, actually, I had those lines underlined because they also reminded me of Cooper. Just returning to the street where we see the Palmer house and, you're returning to where we started. But kind of, it's like you're there for the first time again. And then the very last lines of this really kind of give me chills. I really loved the lines, "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongue of flames are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one." It just, when we think of, again, like imagery in these poems that is also very similar to imagery in Twin Peaks, fire and roses are something that I think really jump out to folks. Like, I feel like I've seen a number of, pins or stickers or things where it's like a blue rose on fire or something. Even our logo for this podcast is a blue rose. So to think of these two images that we tie so much to Twin Peaks being combined in this last line, and the fire and the rose are one. It just really, again, from start to finish, so much of this really jumped out to me as connections to this show that we all love so much. And that's why we wanted to share this with you. We wanted to share 4 Quartets with you guys because, really, to call back to this image of me on the plane reading this for the first time and just sort of frantically taking notes and slapping, sticky notes onto it. This was one of those moments where I was just like, oh my God, are you kidding me? This is so perfect. This is just really, really tying everything together. And also done with such beautiful diction and imagery.
As we said at the beginning, we're just starting the conversation about the resonance of 4 Quartets in The Return. And we hope that essays will be written
Yes.
and other conversations will be had. And we hope that you're inspired to read Four Quartets, to think about how it fits in with The Return. It's been really rewarding for us. And we're grateful that you came along for these conversations.
Yeah, it was something that we were so excited to share with you guys. We both had such a deep emotional connection to these poems, I think.
And these conversations have been challenging.
Yeah, we have talked between the two of us that these two episodes have probably been two of the most difficult that we've done for many reasons. It's just really dense, heavy content, and also very emotional at times.
Well, we won't be back on until after the holidays.
Yeah.
So we want to wish you a very happy holiday season.
Yes, and when we return, we'll have something very fun to share with you guys.
So if you're looking for something to do over the holidays, but you want to stay in an uplifted mood, you want to watch some films that will make you happy, that are very, very sweet, you can also be preparing for our next episode.
Yes, so our next episode is going to be on Jacques Tati. So if you want to watch his movies, they are actually, a lot of them are available on the Criterion channel right now. So even if you just wanted to get a subscription briefly for like a month to watch through these movies, there's something that they're so playful and fun and perfect for the holiday season. And that is going to be what our next episode is going to focus on. So it's going to be very light, very fun. We're going to have a lot of really good times with this one.
Yes. And Tati is one of David Lynch's favorite directors. And so we'll see lots of wonderful connections between his films and the work of David Lynch.
So as always, listeners, if you are interested, check us out on Instagram. You can follow us there. We usually try to post images that really connect with the episodes too, so it's also just helpful to follow. You can also email us as well if you have any questions or ideas that you wanted to share with us.
So thank you for listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening.
We're going to leave you with It Was Laura.
And she's come to kiss you goodbye.
Goodbye, listeners.
Goodbye.
It was Laura. And I saw her glowing. I saw her